Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Debatable Discussions podcast. Today we're incredibly lucky to have a guest with us in Nigel Biggar. And John, can you please introduce Nigel to our guest?
So yes, today we are joined by Professor Dr. Nigel Biggar. Nigel is currently a Baron. He's a member of the House of Lords. He's also very well known for his career teaching at Oxford University and leading the Empire and the Ethics Project, under which he wrote his book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. Nigel, it's an honour to have you with us today.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Dejan, for the invitation. I look forward to our conversation.
So without further ado, we thought we'd perhaps look into theology, as you were the Regius Professor of Theology at Oxford. So firstly, what philosophers or theologians have particularly shaped your thinking?
Early on, the theology of Karl Barth, who was probably the leading, or one of the leading Protestant theologians of the 20th century, he was Swiss-born. His theology early in my career was very influential, and I was interested in it because he developed over a multi-volume set of books. He developed a systematic theological view of the world, and I wanted to climb into it to see what a systematic, comprehensive theological view of the world looked like. So I spent about 10 years off and on working on him. Since then, I've swung from Protestant to more Roman Catholic. So the scholastic method of the famous Catholic theologian Thomas Aquinas and those who follow Thomas Aquinas, the Thomists, that attracts me because I like precision. I like rational method, and the scholastic method is very methodical and clear in a way often that Protestant theology, frankly, is not. So I'm an Anglican, so I get to draw from all sorts of wells, both Protestant and Catholic, and I've certainly made use of the broad church that the Church of England is.
So, talking about the Church of England and the Roman Catholic and Protestant churches, how do you think your Christian faith has shaped your approach to thinking about historical events, politics, ethics in general?
Well, one way is that I'm well aware that I am, and we are all creatures. We're not gods, so we have limited power and limited knowledge. What's more, even such power and knowledge as we have is vulnerable to being distorted by what Christians call sin, what might be better called exaggerated or distorted loves. And so not only is my knowledge and power limited naturally, but also it sometimes is morally distorted. And what that implies, or what it implies practically, is humility. So when I look at how my ancestors behaved, I do so with humility. I do so sensitive to the fact that their circumstances were not mine. I mean, I get to live in, as you do, you get to live in a Britain that enjoys unprecedented wealth, health, and security. And most of our ancestors did not enjoy that. And when we judge how they behaved, we need to put ourselves in their shoes. So I think, among other things, the way in which my Christian theological view of the world shapes how I deal with judging the past. It's this notion of creaturely limits and sinful distortion, and how we're all subject to those, and how people in the past, they behaved because of their circumstances as we behave according to our circumstances. So we're not gods, we're creatures.
And in particular, I thought we could perhaps delve into the issue of warfare, because am I right in saying that you agree with the just war theory? Why do you agree with
Yes,
this?
I do.
Purely because a criticism that's sort of often heard at sort of GCSE or A level at school, is that it's not sort of on the same line as the teachings of Jesus. Jesus was someone against warfare, was against violence. So, yeah, why do you agree with the just war theory?
Well, I agree with just war theory because I mean we all want peace. Peace is nice, and war is not nice. It's violent, and so if we could do without war, that'd be great. But what I say is that peace is complicated. So, for example, in 1994, we in the UK stayed at peace. We didn't go to war. But because we didn't go to war and other European countries didn't go to war in Rwanda, that left the Hutu at peace to slaughter 800,000 Tutsi. So our peace left other people at peace to perpetrate genocide. So all I'm saying here is that peace is complicated. We all want peace, but the question to ask is whose peace and at what cost? So we could have. Last night I just watched for the third or fourth time the excellent film *The Darkest Hour* about May 1940, when Churchill had to decide whether or not to make peace with Nazi Germany, and we could have done that. But it would have saved some lives, but it would also have allowed Nazi tyranny to dominate Europe and dominate us, and we know what that tyranny involves. So the first thing to say is we all want peace, but peace is complicated, and sometimes peace carries very considerable costs that other people have to pay. That's the first thing. As for Jesus and war, yes, looking at the Gospels, it does seem you can read Jesus as preaching a gospel of pacifism, that one should never use violence. But I think one has to understand Jesus in his context. That's to say, he wasn't a politician. He wasn't from the upper classes. He didn't live in a democracy, so he had no direct means of taking part in government. He was a son of a carpenter and an itinerant preacher. So when he's talking about how to deal with other people's abuse of you, his context is mainly family or intimate or local relations. He's not thinking about politics, because politics wasn't within his wasn't what it was way above his pay grade. And it's only in the early years of the church when you begin to get Christians who were involved in government, but mostly only when Christianity became tolerated after the year 313 AD in the Roman Empire, that Christians begin to shoulder the responsibilities of government. And that's why in the early 400s, you get Christian military tribunes. These are people responsible for keeping law and order. And in order to keep law and order, they sometimes have to use violence. And as Christians, their consciences are troubled. And so they write to St. Augustine, Bishop of Hippo in North Africa, and they say, how can we square our Christian beliefs with our public responsibilities? And that it was Augustine's response to those questions that began the tradition of the Christian theory of justified use of force or just war. But in answer to the question, how can you square Jesus with this? The first point is Jesus. The question of political responsibility didn't really occur to Jesus, because they weren't within his world. One can draw implications from what Jesus said for politics, but not directly. And the other thing to say is, in the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, there are three occasions, I think, when either Jesus or the apostles come across Roman military centurions, and not once do they tell the centurions they should give up their profession because it's not compatible with their Christian faith. And on every occasion, I think, the centurions are praised for their faith, but they're not required to abandon their military profession, which does suggest that in the eyes of Jesus and of the apostles, that maybe Christian faith and military profession are not incompatible.
So that was a really interesting sort of perspective on peace. How do you think that applies nowadays in the 21st century, 2025, with everything happening around both in Europe and all over the world? Do you think countries such as Britain should play an active role? Should they just step back?
Well, we can't step back. I mean, there may have been a time when we thought we could step back, but our own security is increasingly under threat, and so it's not responsible to step back, unless you don't care who rules the world. I mean, since all of my lifetime and all of yours to this point, the United States has dominated, and on the whole, that's been a good thing, because notwithstanding the present woes of the United States, it does remain a democracy with institutions that, so far, can constrain executive government, institutions of law, for example. But if the US ceases to dominate, then the likely successors will be China, or to be precise, the Chinese Communist Party. And I myself would prefer not to live under the Chinese Communist Party. And if you want to see what life would be like, then observe what happened to Hong Kong in the last 10 years. So if we care about whether or not we live under a totalitarian regime, then we should care about our security, and that means among other things, being prepared to use military force. I mean, one reason for strengthening our military force is actually to be able to present an effective deterrent. And if you present an effective deterrent, then you won't have to use military force. The danger is, if you don't present an effective deterrent, then you back yourself into a corner where you might have to use it. So better to strengthen ourselves now, for example, to discourage Russia from crossing any of NATO's borders. I think that's extremely important, and that's why I think that even though Ukraine will have to compromise, it won't recover all its pre-2014 territory. Even though that's the case, I do think it's important that Vladimir Putin learn that what he's done to Ukraine, he cannot repeat elsewhere, and also President Xi with regard to Taiwan.
Linked to these ideas of peace and conflict, perhaps we could transition on to the next sort of segment of the podcast, which is on history, and in particular the British Empire. So could you perhaps summarise your views on the British Empire, which have obviously attracted some sort of controversy?
Yes. So first of all, when we consider the British Empire, we must put it in context. One context was that empire was a universal political, universal phenomenon, a universal political form practiced by every people in every continent from the dawn of time. And it has been said that most people in history have lived under empires of one kind or the other. Secondly, the mass migration of peoples is a universal phenomenon. So the British Empire consisted partly of the mass migration of people from England, Ireland, and Scotland and Wales across the Atlantic to North America, and then subsequently to Australia. This migration impacted native peoples in both those places, initially in negative ways, in the end, arguably positively. But the mass migration of peoples is universal. The Iroquois migrated north of the Great Lakes in North America in the 1600s, overwhelmed the Huron. The Comanche expanded in the southwest of what's the US, and overwhelmed the Apache and created a vast slave economy, according to one historian. The Zulu expanded westward in the 1820s in South Africa, scattering other African peoples to 3 of the 4 winds. And the Maori expanded when they sailed across to the Chatham Islands from what is now New Zealand in 1835, where they slaughtered 10% of the population and enslaved the rest. So, when you're thinking about British migration, British worldwide exploration, the establishment of colonies, the British were not unique in this at all, and nor were they unique in being involved in slavery for 150 years or so. That's the first thing to say. Second, I'd say, and in the conclusion of my book, I lay out this argument. I say, if you survey 400 years of British Empire from Newfoundland to New Zealand, you find, yes, the empire presided over bad stuff, slavery, spread of disease, theft or seizure of unjust seizure of land, racial prejudice, etc. But I challenge you to find any 400-year-old state of which that isn't true. As a Christian, I don't expect perfection of my ancestors any more than I expect perfection of contemporary people. And so, yes, there's bad stuff there, and we should lament it. But there was also in the imperial ledger a credit column too. For example, the development of the conviction in the late 1700s that slavery is abhorrent, and then the movement to abolish first slave trading and then slavery within the British Empire, and then the use of imperial power worldwide for the rest of the empire's life, suppressing slavery from Brazil to New Zealand. And I said that slavery and slave trading were universal institutions. Britain was among the first states in the history of the world to abolish both and then to suppress both of them worldwide. And then you get the spread of liberal institutions to the empire. The empire was not democratic until the 1930s in India, but then Britain didn't achieve universal suffrage, adult equal suffrage until 1928. But notwithstanding the lack of democracy, the British did establish institutions of a free press and of an independent judiciary, which held colonial governments to account in a way that the governments of Communist China, Putin's Russia, the Ayatollah's Iran are not held to account to this day. And then finally, I'd say that something important is revealed about the character of the British Empire in the fact that in 1939, the empire committed itself to combat the massively murderous, genocidal, racist regime in Nazi Berlin. And from May 1940, when France fell, until June 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the British Empire offered Nazi Germany the only military resistance, with the sole exception of Greece. And if you find yourself traveling in northeast Sicily and you're driving south of Mount Etna, and you're driving eastwards from Regal Buta to Agira, you will notice on the left-hand side at a certain point a cemetery. If you pull over and get out of your car, walk into the cemetery, you'll find yourself surrounded by young Canadians. And if you walk around enough, you will come across one dedicated to a certain H.R. Anderson, aged 28, killed on the 18th of July, 1943. And his headstone bears the epitaph, "Anti-Fascist Fighter." And Anderson was a volunteer. There were no conscripts in Canada at that time. Anderson answered the call to fight fascism. Who called him? The British Empire. So whatever bad stuff the empire presided over, and it did, I think one can say that as it grew and matured, it became more humanitarian and more liberal, and that's about the most we can expect of any state.
And that is really interesting there, because especially the narrative, I think, that's traditionally told about the empire overlooks all those aspects. And I think, and that was personally the thing which I really gained from reading your book, is that even if you don't agree with it, I think you've at least got to understand that there are aspects outside of this narrative which we should recognize how the empire was beneficial.
No, absolutely, John. And you can be forgiven, given your age, for saying traditionally. Actually, the view that dominates your world is one that has only dominated for about 7 years, or 8 years, or 10 years. The view I present actually was pretty unremarkable 15, 20 years ago. But you're right. The relentless denigration of European British empire and colonialism is a major feature of our current culture, and it needs to be corrected because it's false, and it also produces, I think, unhelpful guilt, and it doesn't, in my view, help race relations at all to say that white people are all bad and non-white people are just victims. It wasn't true, and it doesn't help.
So you talked about this sort of perspective that a lot of people hold nowadays, and perhaps a good question is, what do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of the British Empire? You've given us a couple of examples, but if there's one that truly stands out, which do you think that is?
But I think, Dejan, the irony is, what I'm doing and what my book does is to talk up the humanitarian and liberal elements in the empire, which were certainly there, and these are the ones that are systematically ignored and dismissed. So, ironically, I'm saying we should admire the progressive parts of the empire, because I think there were, and I think it's really important that we admire what deserves to be admired among our ancestors. So that, and by all means, lament the stuff that was bad, so we don't repeat it, but admire and follow and promote the liberal and humanitarian element. So I think, Diana, to answer your question, I do think that the growth of a humanitarian and liberal conscience in the course of the 19th century was really important, and it didn't manifest itself in every empire. It certainly didn't manifest itself in King Leopold's Congo, and it was certainly not manifest in the Japanese Empire of the 1930s and 1940s. So the British Empire was relatively distinctive. I think the French Empire was perhaps not so different, but the idea that one has dominant power in order to emancipate slaves, or in order to enable Aboriginal peoples to develop and become equal citizens of a new modernized society, not simply to annihilate them. That was relatively distinctive, and the fact is that countries like New Zealand and Australia and Canada and the United States now are, according to certain measures, and Britain, are among the least racist countries on earth. The World Values Survey 2023 asked two questions of interviewees in 17 countries. One was, would you object to having an immigrant as a neighbour? And the other, would you object to having someone of a different race as a neighbour? And the Anglo-Saxon countries, which were all, even the US originally, part of the British Empire, are among the least racist, in stark contrast to China, Japan, Russia, and Iran. And I'm not saying that there has been horrible racism both in the empire and in Britain in the past, but we've combated it, and no doubt there is still racial prejudice now, but we are combating it, and we've been actually pretty successful, and certainly very successful comparatively. And it's not a coincidence that these countries, former members of the British Empire, have developed and strengthened these liberal traditions.
I think that's a very interesting parallel you make there between sort of different world empires. Why do you think that the British and, as you said, the French Empire are a bit distinctive in comparison to others?
Well, it's certainly partly to do with. Let me not speak for the French, but the English or the British Empire. I mean, we had in this country um, a peculiar political development whereby, from quite early on, we developed institutions whereby executive power was constrained. We had monarchs, but even in the medieval period, French observers were astonished at the degree to which English kings were constrained by their parliament. And then that of course, was confirmed in the 1600s in the course of the English Civil War. So we developed institutions and customs that would constrain executive power, and by the 19th century, the custom whereby governments are voted in and voted out, and they leave with grace, and they don't resort to violence. And so, to some extent, it's because of our own political evolution that then affected the institutions and the customs we spread worldwide. Another influence was Christianity. I mean, um, the movement to abolish slavery was inspired partly by Enlightenment philosophers like Montesquieu in France, but the Enlightenment philosophers influenced only the literary elite, people like Adam Smith in Scotland. The abolition movement was a popular movement. In 1791, something like 20% of the male population of the country signed petitions to abolish slavery. This was long before mass democracy, long before social media, long before mass communication. So that's quite remarkable. And at the popular end, it wasn't Enlightenment philosophy, it was Christian conviction, the conviction that all human beings are equal under God, regardless of race. So I'd say those were two reasons for the relatively humanitarian and liberal character of the British Empire.
Oh, so thank you very much, Nigel, for joining us today. I hope our listeners had fun listening to you because, I mean, personally for me, I learned lots of new things, but also you offered a narrative and actually a very evaluative and truthful account of the empire, which is rarely told, especially in education, but also in the wider public conscious. So thank you for coming on today.
My pleasure. I'm glad to have this conversation and glad to get the message out there.
And always, if you enjoy this episode, please also, get a copy of Nigel's book, as well as go back to some of our past episodes with guests or just with John and I discussing issues of history and philosophy. Thank you very much and see you next week.
I'll see you.